I have the pleasure of moderating the next panel, and I'm going to jump right into it and switch gears and invite what is now two incredible leaders. Unfortunately, our friend and colleague Leroy has Little Bear is not able to join us, and so we're going to have a little bit more time with Henry Lickers and Karlin Itchoak. And thank you for joining me on screen, both of you. Each will deliver remarks, and again, let's take the time to really have you talk about your own personal stories and your nation's efforts in conservation, particularly in the transboundary space. And then we'll go into a facilitated discussion with a few questions for the panelists. And then if we have time, we'd love to take perhaps a few questions from the audience to help color this panel. So without further ado, Henry Lickers is a Haudenosaunee citizen of the Seneca Nation and a member of the Turtle Clan. He's been director of the Mohawk Council for 32 years and is now the environmental science officer for the nation. Throughout his career, Lickers has been instrumental in incorporating First Nations peoples and knowledge into environmental planning and decision making. And you know, Henry, I'm a little bit of a fangirl here in the screen. I've been a long-time fan of your work, and I was exposed about 20 years ago to some of your work that you were doing with the federal government. And I'm very, very pleased that you're here with us today. And after Henry, we'll hear from Karlin Itchoak. Karlin is Inupiat, Alaska Native, and is the Alaska State Director for the Wilderness Society. He has an undergraduate degrees both in Alaska Native Studies and in political science from the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and a law degree from Gonzaga University. He's served as the elected president of the Nome Eskimo Community Tribal Council. By the way, just as a little aside, Karlin, I don't know if you know this, but Eskimo, I think, comes from our word Isameo, which is our way of describing our Inuit neighbors in our language. So just a little trivia piece for you. He's currently on the boards of the Alaska Center and Alaska Institute for Justice. So we'll first turn it over to Henry, and then we'll go to you, Karlin. So Henry, over to you.
Oh, glad to be here. I tell you, you did a dangerous thing asking a Seneca to come. We were known as the orators of the Haudenosaunee, and we can talk for days. So I'll try to keep it brief and tell you some of the things that I think are important with this. In Akwesasne, about 40 years ago, in 1976, the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, the elected band council on the Canadian side, decided that it was about time we start looking at the environment from a non-native way. These people on the outside had just started Environment Canada, and they had figured out what the word environment meant. And in the United States, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, had just started. So we figured that we better start at the same time because, God, they've got a lot to catch up with us. And so we started at that time, and they advertised through the normal grandmothers. You know, you always tell your grandmother what you need, and then she goes around to all of the other nations and says, have we got anybody? Well, they found me as a biologist right out of university, you know, with my degree clutched tight in my hand. And they said, what only thing we want you to do is just take care of all of the environment on the reserve. The reserve sits in Quebec, Ontario, and New York State. So I have two federal governments to deal with, two provinces and a state in the United States. And they said, oh yes, you'll be able to do that. That's no problem. Well, there was nobody else around at that time. And words like conservation and all of these things, oh, they didn't belong to us. They belonged to somebody else. And so it was interesting to me that here they're saying, well, do you know about conservation? What conservation is? Oh, we define it this way. And the way they handed it to me was as if they knew everything about it, and that the words that they used were the proper words of science that was going to establish what they are. It soon really became apparent to me that they really didn't know what conservation meant. They had really almost no understanding of it, even though they had been working on it supposedly for hundreds of years, whether it was through parks or whatever. But they didn't have the on the land understanding of the environment. They didn't know how the badgers talk to each other. They didn't know how the trees talk to each other. They didn't know that these animals and plants communicated among themselves always. But they looked at the systems and they were defining what they were. It was at that point that my great-grandmother and grandfather decided, they said, well, we're going to talk to you in English from now on. And they talked very good English. And they used to train me how to speak in English so that I wouldn't sound like I came from out back the bush. And again, they wanted me to be able to present. They said, because in this world that's coming, we're going to need translators. We're going to need people who can translate between the traditional knowledge that we know and the sciences and the Western way of doing things. Because if we don't, what will happen is they will continue to come to us telling us how they do things and how it's much better than anybody else. I call that intellectual welfare, you know, and our people fall into the habit of looking at over the fence or into that other boat on and seeing how they do something, and it's all nice and shiny, and we go, oh, we're going to do it that way too. And we change the name of it from something others to our own. And then we say it's Mohawk science or whatever, instead of looking to see how we can show them how a different way of thinking actually will be a benefit. The other people that I think we need in conservation is the integrators. The Western sciences tend to reduce everything. So they say, well, we're going to reduce it to standard temperature and pressure in a lab, and we can test that because we are only looking at one variable. And so therefore we can talk about that one variable. Well, if you're a hunter, you know that's not going to help you. You know, to reduce a polar bear to just his claws is not going to help you get that polar bear. It'll probably get you eaten on the ground if you go out. And so our people were integrators. We took vast amounts of different information from many different people. We brought it together. We saw how it would be useful to us. And then we utilized that in our everyday activities. So when you ask an Indigenous person about conservation or environment, they have to sit there for a few minutes, think about it, because they have to translate it from their way of thinking into your way of thinking. And then they look at the person who's talking to you. I always like it when you ask people, you know, what is the disease model of Native people? And the first thing they always say, oh, Native people believe that spirits cause disease. And I almost know where that comes from, because I could just see a Jesuit priest who was a doctor coming up to one of my medicine people and saying to him, how are diseases caused? And the medicine person looks at this Jesuit priest and says, this guy won't understand T viruses. He doesn't even know bacteria exist. How am I going to explain it to him? And so in frustration, our translator went, spirits cause disease. And he ran away all happy, wrote it down, and now you can find it in every textbook, how our people look at diseases. Our people had intimate knowledge of disease and intimate knowledge of how it worked. And we knew the plants that were associated with that and how to take care of them. And so I think those translators and integrators are the type of people where our traditional knowledge is. A hunter, a farmer, he's just as much a scientist as anybody I know. And I've worked for 40 years with them at Akwesasne and beyond that with my grandparents. And they knew what science was. They knew how to observe. They knew how to make experiments, to do things in order to make their lives better. So the possession of those words, I think, is one of the things that we have to watch out for. And we also have to watch out for the concept of intellectual welfare, where they give to us and we're supposed to, it takes our initiative away. The other thing I would say to you is that the arguments right now among conservation people, to me, is quite amusing. It's quite good. I've had a number of my friends. I work in forestry, I work in hunting and fishing, I work in all of those things on the science side, but also with my traditional knowledge side. And it's funny to me because you have the conservationists that we have to save everything. Oh my God, we got to put all of the world in a museum and never touch it again because that will conserve it. On the other side, you have the environmental goods and services people. And they look at a tree and they go, oh, what service does this give us? And how much is it worth? When it stands in the forest, is it really valuable? And they all have to go through some great numeration to determine what the value of that tree is, standing, cut, or used, or in other ways. And so now they're just integrating in how you can look at that tree. So I find it really funny sometimes that, you know, you have these two extremes of people who look at the environment and they both think they're right. Well, I'm right. And they hold it up, you know, I almost want to say like a Christian with a cross, you know, that they're right. And here, the poor native people, our people, sit in between and say, well, how can I save all of the walleye? Because I eat them. They're really good and they sustain my family. But I do want to make sure that we appreciate them for the value that they give us. And so what you're seeing right now, I think, is this push and sway of people trying to find allies among native people for their point of view. And sometimes we got to really watch out for that, because the number of people that used to come to Akwesasne and say, have I got a deal for you? We want to come and help you take care of the environment. And, you know, I could see the elders being very polite and saying, thank you very much. Oh, we'd appreciate your help. Now, would you like a bowl of corn soup? You know, we know how to take care of the environment, and we've been doing it for centuries. So I've been asked a number of times a question, why have I joined the IJC? It seems like, you know, this is a group of people, scientists and that care for the boundary waters that flow between all of the waters. Do they cover all of the waters? No, they don't. They don't cover them all, and we're trying to see how we can do that. The treaty was brought in 1909, and of course it makes no mention of Native people in it. It makes no mention of women in it. It's like, it's that period of time, all those years ago, was the way they thought of it. And now, after 115 years of the IJC existing, they finally got the sense to put an Indigenous person on it. And again, we have to talk to, I have to translate traditional knowledge. I have to, as an integrator, show them how they can work together. And I'm just really pleased that now I have so many other examples that I can use. So from my own work at Akwesasne, working with the International Joint Commission, and from my work with my own people for 40 some odd years, I'm finding that they're beginning to understand the complexity of the world around them. And they're saying, how do we save that? And suddenly somebody's going, oh, I remember this guy. You know, he talked to me about that. Oh my God, what was his name? Where was he? And they're going out and searching for those people again. And our elders, God bless them, are still there. And you would think, with all of the damage that was done and all of the harm that was done to our people through residential school, you would think that they would not be welcoming. And yet the hand is still out. The hand of friendship is still out there, saying to them people, come, we'd like to try and teach you. It's a long road, but it's one that's very worthwhile. So I see those type of things in my life. I start out as a young biologist. You know, like I said, the degree touched kite in my hand. I knew all of everything. I could solve all the problems. And I found that the sciences only took me so far. They only took me so far. The real problems that we have are the ones in building relationships between each other, between the sciences and traditional knowledge, but also between the animals and ourselves. We don't usually try to think about those sometimes, but like I said, I had a very good friend of mine who was a badger, and he didn't speak English, and I didn't speak badger very well, but we got on to know each other really well, and I looked at him as my brother. And so that's, I think, what we're starting to experience now as we try to move forward with the concepts of conservation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks, Henry. And now I'd like to turn it over to Karlin to tell us more about his work in his homelands in Alaska in asserting their vision for conservation.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you, Henry, for your remarks. My name is Karlin Itchoak. My Inupiaq name is Nageak Itchoak, and I'm here on the unceded territory of the Dena'ina people here in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm the Alaska State Director. My grandparents, Wilbur and Cora Itchoak, are from Utqiagavik, from formerly known as Barrow, and on my mother's side, Norman and Margaret Irvin are from upstate New York, German Irish from Mohawk territory. And I talk about my grandparents to tell you a lot about myself. I come from maybe two different worlds, and that's kind of what I'm doing here at the Wilderness Society, is trying to blend these two important worlds to help us better conserve nature. And so today it's been an honor to been asked to be on this panel, and today I've been asked to talk about the Imago Initiative. The Wilderness Society was founded in 1935 by an amazing group of scientists and conservationists who have led a lot of the nation's conservation history here in the United States, helping create the Wilderness Act, helping create the Wildlife Refuge System and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and other important areas. So we have a long history at the Wilderness Society of protecting public lands. So maybe just to back up and tell you a little bit about myself, Valerie mentioned that I have a law degree, and I was born and raised in Nome, Alaska, and I grew up whale hunting with my uncles in Utqiagavik and seeing the land and the world through an indigenous worldview, but also going to law school, kind of like Henry's background, where he talks about coming back from school with a degree in hand and everyone expecting us to protect the land and looking to us for leadership. And you may be thinking, how is a Inupiaq working at one of the oldest national conservation groups? It's an interesting fit for me. And I can tell you that some of my relatives up north weren't too happy with my job choice. As you may know or realize, Indigenous people haven't always had great relationships with conservation groups, or not always with the federal government either. And so for me, this was a big leap, a big switch to join a national conservation group. And I just want to talk a little bit about that from the beginning here. We also heard from Val and from Henry a lot of the similarities and shared values that we have with conservation and with environmental groups. And I think that's an important distinction to make here, and one reason why I decided to join the Wilderness Society. I'm a recovering corporate executive. I was a chief administrative and legal officer for a Native corporation. As you know, in Alaska, we had the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act that created our land claims back in the 60s. And on December 18th, 1971, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was passed. And Indigenous people in Alaska were forced to create these corporations through Congress. And so we became business people overnight. But the important thing to remember about that is on December 17th, 1971, the day before, Indigenous people of Alaska held title, Aboriginal title, to 300, I think it was 365 million acres of land in Alaska we had Aboriginal title to, that our people have used since time immemorial. And then all of a sudden on December 18th, we had 44 million acres of land. And so that dispossession of land, that taking of the land, I think is a big part of what has led to this historical trauma that our people face. High rates of suicide, high rates of alcoholism, dispossession of land, dispossession of culture, dispossession of language, relocation, all of these termination and assimilation policies of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s that have contributed to some of the things that our people are facing today is one reason why I joined the Wilderness Society. I was inspired by Greta Thunberg in Sweden, by her activism, for me, myself, to get off the couch and to use my experience and my degree and my knowledge and my indigenous worldview and connections to help and work with conservation to look at conservation through an indigenous worldview. So when I was going through my interview process here at TWS, I talked about indigenizing and decolonizing conservation, and they hired me anyway. And so once I got on as the Alaska State Director, I was asked, so Karlin, what's your plan? And I said, what's my plan for what? And they said, what's your plan for indigenizing or decolonizing conservation? And I didn't have a plan, but I knew that's something we had to do. And so we worked internally and with our Indigenous and conservation partners to come up with a plan. And this plan we're calling the Imago Initiative. And it's pursuing a new approach for Arctic refuge indigenous protection. And we're also inspired by what Valerie and Henry and others are doing with indigenous protected conserved areas, but also what's happening in Brazil and rural Russia and Australia and other places where governments and nations are looking towards indigenous people for solutions and recognizing their inherent inalienable rights and their sovereignty and their ability to be good stewards of the land since time immemorial. And that is what we're trying to do here at the Wilderness Society. And this initiative is being led by myself and our Imago Initiative coordinator, Mina DeWitt, who's pictured here, who is a healer, a traditional healer by training. And we thought it was important that this initiative be place-based and that our brainstorming and our dialogues happen on the land with Inupiaq people from the Arctic and with Gwich'in, and also with our transboundary international partners within the First Nations of Canada and other areas as well. And so the Imago Initiative is looking at building a new suite of options for public land protections where Indigenous people live on or near public lands, recognizing the rights of Indigenous people. And I'm really proud of the Wilderness Society. I believe that our internal diversity, equity, and inclusion work is what is allowing us to have this outward manifestation of our DEI work. And the Wilderness Society Governing Council recently passed an acknowledgement where they're publicly stating that the Wilderness Society recognizes Native American and Indigenous peoples as the longest serving stewards of the land. TWS respects their inherent sovereignty and self-determination and honors treaty rights, including reserved rights that exist off our reservations. And TWS acknowledges the historic and ongoing injustices perpetrated against Indigenous peoples and are committed to being more conscientious and inclusive and working with Indigenous peoples, and are committed to being more leaders in advancing the establishment of trust and respect in our relationships. We seek the guidance of Native American and Indigenous peoples to effectively advocate for the protection of culturally significant lands and the preservation of language and culture. We strive to support actions that respect the priorities traditional knowledge, interests, and concerns of Native American and Indigenous peoples to ensure a more just and equitable future. And this new perspective from one of the oldest and largest conservation groups in the United States is helping to shape how our other partners in conservation are showing up. And so the Imago Initiative is recognizing that both the Inupiaq and Gwich'in people have been stewards of the land since time immemorial. And both Indigenous groups still depends heavily on the subsistence resources of the coastal plain within the Arctic Refuge. Here we have Sarah James and Nutuk Simmons. Sarah's from Arctic Village, a longtime advocate and leader to protect the land. And also we have Nutuk Simmons, who has been a human rights protector of Inupiaq people for a long time. The Imago Initiative is reimagining our approach to protecting federal lands by transforming partnerships and seeing opportunities through an Indigenous lens. Our short-term goal is to learn and understand how we got it wrong in the past and to figure out how to get it right in the future, to uplift the rights of the Indigenous people. To make this paradigm shift, we're looking at Imago, and this is a place-based initiative, and this is hard to do during a pandemic. It's hard to get people together on the land when you have travel restrictions and a national or international health pandemic. And so fortunately, we've been able to have 4 place-based trips, and we started with 2 of us going to Kaktovik and then 8 of us going into the refuge. And then this summer we brought 22 people, conservation and Indigenous partners, into the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for 8 days, including 5 of our elders who were Inupiaq and Gwich'in, and just connected with each other and the land. That picture that we just faded out of was our founders of the Wilderness Society. And this is a photo of the 22 of us who were in the refuge this summer, having place-based dialogues and brainstorming a new suite of options, hopefully for future protections. But this is a scaffolding approach where we hope to someday in the next few years have a large group of Inupiaq from Kaktovik and a large group of Gwich'in from Canada and from the US meeting together to help develop new land protections. These are some of our Imago trip goals. Safety was number 1. Connecting with each other and with the land was another one. Healing was a big part of it. There was a lot of healing circles, a lot of smudging, a lot of listening to each other in the land, watching the animals. We saw a lot of wolves, caribou, grizzly bears, birds. It was just an amazing experience, and being able to hear our elders and listen to our elders tell stories and about their history and trying to protect the refuge was amazing. So this is something that we're trying to replicate over the next few years and continue bringing Indigenous people onto the land, working with our international partners in Canada as well. We've been working with folks from the International Porcupine Caribou Herd Working Group, from the 6 permanent participants, the International Gwich'in Council, who's a permanent participant of the Arctic Council, and also meeting with different subsistence hunters and elders as well. This last photo that you saw, and I apologize, some of these went by very quickly. We can end the screen sharing if that's okay. The last photo we saw some of our Indigenous partners cleansing in the mud and having a mud bath. And to us, part of the Imago Initiative, a big part of it is the healing and being able to take the time to talk about some of the historical trauma and things that or pain points that bother us or that we've had to deal with in the last few years through this assimilation and termination. And so part of that healing was an aha moment for me, because I realized that the Indigenous people, we're not the only ones that are healing. Our conservation partners are also healing and also have have a lot of things that they are trying to reconcile as well. And so that was an eye-opener for me. And I think the Imago Initiative, this idea came from Winona LaDuke, who's a well-known White Earth reservation leader from Minnesota. She was talking to us during a Just Transitions conference about the imaginal cells in a caterpillar that allows it to transform into a butterfly. And I just love that transformational imagery. And I asked her if we can use that for this initiative. And she said, sure, as long as you invite me to whatever comes of it. And so this is really a process over time, a long-term goal where we're trying to reimagine conservation through an Indigenous worldview. And I'm not sure what it'll produce or what will come from it, but we're hoping that in the end, maybe it'll lead to an enabling statute or to something that will allow us to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and maybe other important public areas in the lower 48 through an Indigenous perspective, and as is being done in Canada, with the Indigenous people at the forefront of those protections and leading the way. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for those excellent opening remarks, Karlin and Henry. I think you've really set us up for a great discussion. In order to kind of launch the discussion, I wonder if the facilitators, the tech gurus behind us, could put us all on the screen at once and air that on the screen. I see they're working on it. Hopefully that'll come up. And I guess for our first kind of question, it is, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about connection. You both spoke about the importance of kind of reconciliation between peoples, whether that is Indigenous and non-Indigenous, between governments, but also with our landscapes and our relationship with those lands. How is that reconnection really a part of your efforts of transboundary conservation? And how can that connection and those relationships really ensure durable outcomes in terms of your conservation efforts? And just for context, you know, Henry, I think about the Haudenosaunee quite a bit. Here in Labrador, our nation was split by the border. We often talk about how the border was put between our legs, and we really had nothing to do with the implementation of those borders. But of course, it's completely affected our lives ever since they've been put in place. And so I'm curious as to kind of your vision of connection with those sorts of realities. So maybe over to you, Henry, and then we'll go to Karlin.
Well, we were very warlike people. The Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations that were there in the far, far past, were at war with each other forever. And they were beating each other up terribly. And so a peacemaker came to us. And that peacemaker gave us a method and a way in which we could, the great way of peace, in which we could use that great way of peace in order to learn how to live together. So if you can teach a Mohawk how to be peaceful, that's an amazing thing, you know. That's and if you can teach a Seneca how not to talk so much, that's again an amazing feat. And so we've used that great way of peace with all of our relationships with non-native people. So in Canada, for example, we helped start the Eastern Ontario Model Forest and use the way of peace as the way in which we would work with them, but how they would work with each other, which was amazing to me because I thought, oh my God, they must know how to work with each other, but they don't. Scientists don't know how to work with common people or the public. They're just learning. I think they call that citizen science now, but you know, they're learning how to do it. Well, the Haudenosaunee have been studying confederacies, peace, and that for 1,200 years. And so I had the advantage from my grandparents and my aunties and uncles to be able to try to teach that to non-native people. And it was interesting to me because they suddenly went, wow, this is a way in which we can form relationships and we can evaluate how those relationships are. One small little story that says how important that was. When Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin wrote the American Constitution, or penned it, they took most of the thinking and ideas and even some of the words straight out of the Great Way of Peace, the Mohawk and the Haudenosaunee Constitution, because Jefferson and Franklin both sat in on the Great Council to hear how we maintain peace among these. The other person who picked it up was Marx in Russia. And if you read Das Kapital, you'll find it in the footnotes that he says, oh, there were these primitive people who practiced a basal form of communism in which all of them benefited from working together as a unit. And that became the basis for the Communist Manifesto. So my grandfather said, not only did we give all these things to him, but we also gave him the two greatest forms of government in the world, and they buggered them both up. So again, I think our knowledge doesn't only extend to practical things on the ground, like how a caribou walks or what, it extends also to this concept of governance. And it's been seen as valuable over the years. You know, very few people would know the history of, for example, the American Constitution and how it was written. But the Haudenosaunee were in that writing, even though we didn't sign anything. I guess they didn't like the fish marks on the Constitution. So there is, like, when we build relationships, even to today, we use that Great Way of Peace as the way in which we see how that peace is working and how it doesn't. And it only takes 3 words. The Great Way of Peace is translated as respect, equity, and empowerment, translated into English. I've known this since I was a boy, but it's taken me till I'm 70 now to figure out the thousands and thousands of implications that are in those 3 simple words.
Thanks, Henry. And I'm gonna push you a little bit further in the response to that question. But how does that then translate in the work that you're doing at the IJC, and how are your contributions really pushing the agenda in terms of how it operates in managing transboundary waters that are our Great Lakes?
And let me back up a bit. Remember that when we were put into power or put into these positions, 2 years ago and so on and so forth, you can imagine the people on our side. We have Marilyn Fail in there, who's a lawyer from out west who deals with land claims and so on. We have Pierre Belin, who's worked on beluga whales and in the Great Lakes, and not the Great Lakes, but in the oceans. And he worked with Akwesasne as well. So they're friends. I know them from years. But on the American side, the fear, of the Trump era and having these Republicans being brought in, there was great trembling. Let's just put it that way. There was big trembling. What would they bring? And what we found is that when they came and we discussed what our responsibilities were, which is the responsibilities to the international waters, and within certain bounds of that, they were going, yeah, we agree with that. We want to make sure that they're safe. We want to make sure that the flows are regulated in a proper manner. We want to make sure we protect the animals and the environment. And suddenly we had 3 different people with different skill sets that, as my grandmother would say, could make a really good stew. And so all of us got together and we began to work on looking at what issues. We even looked up north into Alaska and the Yukon, because we know there are rivers up there that maybe the International Joint Commission should have some look over the fence and see what you're doing. The other thing that was interesting is they sat down and said, what would our priorities be? Climate change came right up first. Leadership, how are we going to do this? But the third one was Indigenous people. That the teachings that Indigenous people can bring to the table are important to the IJC, since that's the way we work. We work by consensus. We don't put swords on the table and determine who's got the most swords. We try to work it through, and that's tough. But I've worked with Grand Council, I've worked with Mohawks. I know how tough that can be, but you can do it. You can work to a point where everybody can say, no, I'll go with that. And then you move forward again. So yeah, with the IJC, it was, for me, was the most peculiar place because I had these people who wanted to work together, sometimes didn't know how, but were willing to learn new ways and willing to step forward and actually take them on.
Thanks, Henry. And I, just as an aside, I've played hockey against Mohawk women before, and I know how fierce y'all can be. Karlin, tell us a little bit more about kind of the efforts of collaboration within Alaska. I mean, you've spoken a lot about kind of the reinforcement of the relationship between the conservation community and the Alaska Native community there. But why transboundary, and what are your efforts in kind of reconnecting and working along with the Gwich'in and Inuvialuit peoples on the Yukon side important to your success in Alaska?
Yeah, great questions, Val. The Wilderness Society in particular has realized that we can't move forward in a good way, as Sarah James would say, without recognizing the rights of the Indigenous people and the years that Indigenous people have been the stewards of the land. And I think we're starting to recognize that we have a mutual international responsibility and obligation not only to protect and conserve transboundary wildlife and land, but also cultures. And Henry was talking about relationships, and when you realize that the Indigenous people's relationship with the land is so intrinsic and close. We listened to the Gwich'in talk about how humans became caribou, and they made an agreement with the caribou that they would take care of them and protect them. And there was a mutual reciprocity where the caribou would protect the people. The Inupiaq have same beliefs with the polar bear, with the bowhead whale, with the caribou, with other animals, where we're all related, we're relatives. And so to us, it's just, it's who we are, to our connection with the land, with the animals. It's a long, close spiritual relationship. And we look at the land in a different way as the Western society. And that's just one example of our different worldviews, as both of you know, and everyone who's on here. Western culture has has a different view of land ownership. In law school, we learn about the bundle of sticks. And if you have all the bundle of sticks, you own the land in fee simple absolute title. It could be divisible, divisible, descendable, alienable. You can divide it, sell it, do anything you want with it. Indigenous people, we never believe that we own the land. The land didn't belong to us. We belong to the land. And we have a relationship with the land where if we take care of it, it will take care of us. So all of these different worldviews are counterintuitive with the corporate culture, sometimes with conservation culture, and with the way the federal government manages these lands. So trying to find the common ground, one thing that we're doing with our place-based brainstorming is that we're creating word maps and identifying what words do Indigenous people not use to describe the land. Wilderness, wild, all of these words that we use in conservation, Indigenous people don't use. How can something be wild if we live in harmony with it? And so that's one thing we're trying to do at first, is identify a word map where what are the good words and bad words to describe our relationship with the land, our stewardship, and our historical ties to the land. And so building this word map with conservation and Indigenous partners to identify those words, because if we create a new bill or a law and we're using words that Indigenous people find harmful, that's counterintuitive to what we're trying to do. So we're starting with words. We're also starting with a value map. We're mapping all the Indigenous values that we can come up with, all of the conservation and wilderness values we can come up with. And then we're looking at what are the shared values between the two of us. and highlighting those values and hopefully new land protections, elevating the shared values. And so as an Indigenous hunter, when we go whale hunting, we were always taught that you're never alone because everything has a spirit, the tundra, the ice, everything has a spirit. You're never alone. We're taught to respect the animals, as you mentioned in your presentation, Val. If we don't treat the animals with respect and we don't share the bowhead whale with others, or if we waste it or don't treat it right, the spirit will go back to the other animals and tell them how they've been treated. If they've been mistreated, they'll just pass the village the next year. If they've been treated with respect, they'll give themselves to us again the next year. And we don't catch animals because we're skilled hunters. We catch them because they gave themselves to us. And so these small examples of different worldviews are what we're trying to capture and incorporate into new land protections, as you're doing with the IPCAs. And to us, that's so important to living up to our mutual international responsibilities and obligations to protecting the land and the wildlife, which is intrinsically connected to our cultures. If we don't protect our cultures and the land together, we're in deep trouble, especially with the Arctic melting and the climate crisis that we're facing now. We don't have time to find the right solutions. We're in a crisis.
Thank you both. And Karlin, I love your reference to how close we are as people to the animal. You know, as my nation has a story about how we're married to caribou, that our relationship is that close that, you know, not only is it that we're related, but we're actually married, and there's a bit of a contract that comes with that marriage. And so I fully understand what you were referring to. You know, I'd like to go a little bit off script and ask you about the importance of the Indigenous approach to dealing with these issues. And in many ways, some of you may have heard and have in your own nations various prophecies that speak to the importance of the role of Indigenous peoples on these issues, that it is, you know, a time after the horror of colonialism and residential schools, and we call that the dark period. And we're now coming into a period of light, and in particular, a period where our women are going to have a special role and a needed role in the advancement and creating the context for collaboration and solutions related to the crises that we're facing. And so I just want to offer you guys a chance to kind of speak to that paradigm shift and how in particular the role of women in our communities is being recognized as we're engaging in strengthening our nationhood and engaging on the issues of conservation and stewardship. Over to you.
Okay. Well, you're talking to Haudenosaunee, and we're matriarchal, matrilinear, and matriloquial, so you're talking to the converted here already. No, we say that there was a dark time, and the dark time was there, and a lot of the nations lost their way. They were being led astray from the way in which we lived before. And my grandmother always used to say that we looked at the shiny new things that were there, and those shiny things blinded us to the way that we should be existing. And it was up for our women to make sure that they maintained and kept that culture, the understanding of it, and our elders that could maintain that. But it was a real struggle. You know, my great grandmother, and remember, we in the East here had these people, these settlers coming in long before anybody else did, and we sent travelers right across the country warning about the black robes when they get to your community. So I'm happy to see that you guys saved a lot of stuff up there, and that, because I tell you, the 6 trees that we got at Arkwasasne are beautiful, but I'd like a lot more of them. So again, it was our women who gave us the strength to be able to resist all of these different changes that were there. And did we have prophecies? Yeah, we have prophecies about the waters, The waters are going to be the most precious things in our world. They will be more precious than anything else. You know, the trees will begin to die from the top down. You know, there's hundreds of these type of sayings that will go on. And you'd almost think that we were fatalistic in saying, oh yeah, we're going to go to wreck and ruin. And my grandfather said, yeah, we are fatalistic. It will. That's the reason you have to fight so hard against these things. And so every person in the Haudenosaunee pick up that clause. And we turn to our women and say, can you help us and give us the strength to be able to go out and do that? I knew in Akwesasne, when a subject got to the point that I was working on, was saying contaminants, that the women said to me, Henry, don't worry about this one anymore. We'll take it over. When they did that, I had no fear at all that they didn't know what they were doing. They went ahead, they did studies, they did things, and have progressed immensely on these type of things. Again, as men, we have responsibilities as hunters and farmers and trappers and things like that, but we also have to bring that back to the community. And the community, women are the ones who look at this. So I see this growing in the darkness. The non-native society pushed our women, and they pushed their own women over there as well. And it's now that they're beginning to realize that that point of view is necessary. They have to integrate that point of view into the world in which we live. We're not the same. You know, the way a woman thinks and the way a man thinks are different, but it's the differences that will help give us the solutions to the problems we have. So I think the translators right now are going crazy because they've got to work like mad to try and get between in this discussion as well. So thank you.
I might just,
Karlin?
thank you, Val. I might add to what Henry said. For the Imago Initiative, we find we can't do this without leadership from our women. And a lot of conservation CEOs who've been working on this issue for many years and trying to work closer with Indigenous people on the ground have asked me many times, how are we going to do this? How do you stay so optimistic? We've been trying to do this for a long time to come up with a new solution, and working with Native corporate leaders who may be at odds with Indigenous tribal leaders. It's been really hard to break through some of those communication gaps, and I tell them that the key is in our women leaders, our elderly women and our young Native women leaders. And you'll see from the pictures of the Imago Initiative place-based meeting, we had 5 elders. 4 of them were elderly women, and a majority of the participants were women, and many of them young women. And I remember Caleb Pungawi, a respected elder from Savunga, who always told me, Karlin, who is it that sews all the seal skin, the bearded seal skin, to make our umiaks, our boats that keep us alive? It's the women when we're out hunting. It's the women that sew the skins for our clothes to keep us warm. And who tells us when to go hunting and where the food is going to go and be distributed? It's the women. And who tells us when to go and when to stop hunting? It's the women. And he says a lot of these whaling captains act tough and think they're in charge, but there's always elderly women who's deciding all these things. And so I've listened to Caleb and to others, and I hear our elderly women like Sarah James and Nutuk and others who are putting themselves out there despite what other people are saying, and being so brave and courageous and leading when it may not be so easy to lead. And also our young women too, the daughters of some of these corporate leaders, the corporate leaders that want to develop the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's their young daughters who are going out and getting degrees and coming back and saying, we need to protect the land. We can do both. We can take care of our people and make a transition off the fossil fuels into a more regenerative economy, and we can protect our people's culture in a good way. So these young Native women are so amazing and so impressive that we can't do it without our women. And I thank you for bringing that question up.
Thanks, guys. I'll do one more facilitated question, and then hopefully we'll have time for a couple audience questions. I see some of them are coming in as we speak, which is great. You guys are drawing some interest from the audience, and that's what we love to see. So, in terms of your work on the ground, you know, it's not easy. You've both alluded to this being a challenge, but also an opportunity. I wonder if you could both speak a little bit more to that on what are some of the challenge of working really on these efforts, and how do you see your Indigenous-led approach really creating the space for opportunity to advancing conservation for the benefits of all?
Big question, but I think one of the things that I see with this is that the way that our elders and the people in the past have talked about this to the non-natives that have come is finally being heard. And you can't keep saying the same message to a group of people over and over again without some of them hearing it. And I think what's happening now is that the number of people who have heard the message has got big enough that they're starting to go, well, we got to do something about this. And so, you know, again, I look at the work that I've done with in our community in Eastern Ontario. That knowledge is going into non-native people, and they're saying, this is a good way to do things. This is the good way to progress. And it includes the sciences, but it also includes a different way of looking at the world. So I'm quite hopeful. I think that we got a lot of chance here to do stuff. And I think what will happen is that, again, the land is beginning to make the people. Our people were made by the land, and we know that. The non-natives didn't know that. But what's happening now after 500 years is the land is beginning to change them. And they're beginning to say, what lessons do we need to learn in order to live on this land? And I'm just happy that Indigenous people are here to be able to still tell them their stories, tell their kids what the stories are. And suddenly you see them come alive and they begin to say, wow, we can't do it that way that it was done in the past. So the things that I've learned over the period of time is that our stories matter. I think we, in many cases, have to be the translators to make sure that they understand how we felt. And then working with them, we have to integrate the knowledge together. Not that one is better than the other, but that we integrate it together to look for better solutions. So I think we're on a good trip. And although, like I said, we're fatalistic in that, oh, everything's going to go to wreck and ruin. By God, what else have you got to do? The other thing I would say to you is it's so much fun. You go to a native gathering, I don't care where you are, there is so much laughter, so much singing, so much talk and good stuff going on. I don't want to say gossip because we're not supposed to talk gossip, but so much going on. And that when you get involved with that, you can't help but have your spirit lifted. And suddenly you say, hey, there's no problem too big. I can stay up all night and work on this one and we'll get it done by the morning. So that's what I see in this.
Thanks, Henry. And how about for you, Karlin? What do you see are some of your challenges, but also opportunities in the work and the approach that you're taking in Alaska?
Yeah, thank you, Val. Some of the challenges I face being with the National Conservation Group is the fear by our conservation partners that I'm trying to get rid of Big W wilderness and erasing the legacy that our important legacy that our founders helped create. And that's not what we're trying to do at all. We're trying to blend and mix the strengths from the Indigenous culture and from the conservation culture, like Henry talks about, blending all of our strengths and coming up with something even better. because at the end, we're all on the same land and we all depend on the same planet, Mother Earth. It's just how we look at her. And one thing we realize, and I try to remind folks in the conservation world, is that we are trying to protect the land and Mother Earth, but we can't forget that she's protecting us. We're looking at using large swaths of land for their sequestration properties and mitigating climate change. That's a perfect example of Mother Earth protecting us. And we get our food and our life, oxygen and resources from Mother Earth. So just having a paradigm shift and looking at the relationship with Mother Earth. And then also for the Imago Initiative, we realize that it's becoming an acronym for Indigenous Management, Access, Guardianship, Stewardship, and Ownership. We don't know what that'll look like, but those are the opportunities. And working with our relatives in Canada and First Nations is so important, because when the caribou, the birds, and all the other animals, the whales, the walrus, the seals, the polar bear, when they come over to from the Canadian side to the US side, or from the US side to the Canadian side, it's like a bailment. We're taking care of shared resources, but also shared relatives. So we all have the same relatives, and we're taking care of our relatives. And that's why it's imperative that we work together, because we're relying on the same land, the same animals, and also we're all related.
And we're just about to run out of time, but I thought I'd slip in a last question from the audience, which is really one about, there's been space created within Canada for much of this leadership by Indigenous peoples in what is now known as Canada on Conservation. What are, in your views, are some of the lessons of that effort for our neighbors to the south and to the northwest? In your case, Karlin?
For us, I think it's to start with the best practices and look at what other folks are doing and take the good things that are working and learn from the things that aren't, and then build on that based on our own ideas and the space where we're at. So we have a lot to learn, but also the encouragement we get from seeing other nations doing this, making this happen. It's really been powerful.
And for me, it would be us working with the IJC and the work that we do. What it would be is having a good group of Indigenous people who sit on all of our committees, all of our panels, so that they can bring that knowledge from the land to the work that we do. And I think that that's going to be imperative in the future. And I know that my colleagues within the other commissioners want that. They want Indigenous people to be there, to be able to speak freely and work with us on these issues that we have to work on.
And as someone who works on a national view of conservation by Indigenous peoples in Canada, I mean, my thoughts to offer to that question really relate to, as where possible, conservation is an opportunity to assert our nationhood, to increase our authority, and the recognition of our rights and titles over our landscapes. There is a movement afoot called Land Back. In many ways, the advancement of conservation is one of the ways that we can achieve the goal of Land Back. I think also there are lessons around the importance of story. I mean, Henry, you mentioned this. One of the ways that we've been able to convey stories, and you saw the video in the Land Needs Guardians campaign, that is really about uplifting and showcasing our stories, because there is power in those stories. There are lessons, there are laws within those stories, and we think it's important for others to hear that. So certainly sharing stories and being able to convey a vision that is clear, unified, organized, and strong. So I really hope that our experience in Canada can help create that space in other parts of the globe, because the work of Indigenous peoples everywhere is benefiting us all. And again, 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity are located on lands managed or controlled by Indigenous peoples. This is no small feat. So with that, Chinishkabit Nan, thank you on behalf of the panelists, and thank you to the Salazar Symposium, for inviting us all to share with you. This has been a really wonderful discussion, Henry and Karlin. I always love chatting, and I hope that we can continue to collaborate in advancing conservation, both in the US and Canada, but also globally. So, thank you very much.